Welcome to the Andrew Roman Show. What's up, y'all? Hey, if you're joining us on YouTube, you can tell we have a brand new set. If you're just listening, man, you've missed like 3 sets that we've had in this show. How y'all like it? I kind of like it. I feel like it's pretty official. I feel like people listen to me more, like I'm more of an expert whenever I sit down with a computer in front of me and I got this cool mic in front of me and the whole thing. And regardless of it, today we are diving deep into the topic of the founding of America. I ain't going to give you much of an intro because I need all the time that I can have. You see, today I'm joined by my beautiful mug right over here. This is Fort McHenry mug, quite patriotic since we're just coming. It actually has a Star-Spangled Banner, the lyrics, yet because no one knows them, so I actually just take the mug and whenever our national anthem comes in, I can just sing it off the mug. Yeah, I'm actually a mug collector. Fun fact. So you might see some of my collection throughout the episode. So watch on YouTube so you can see these cool, one-of-a-kind, legendary mugs. All right, that's my introduction. Let's dive deep into this, man. It was 4th of July. It's an exciting holiday. But is it, though? It received some hate, it received some criticism, like, are we celebrating a racist nation? Well, today we're going to dive deep into it. So I hope you're buckled up. We're not going to waste any time. Don't skip anything. You really want to watch the entire thing because this is going to give you a buttload, excuse my French, but a watermelon load of facts and of reason. So let's start into it. First, we're going to set the stage in the context, okay? So back in 2015, President Barack Obama, on an interview on the podcast with stand-up comedian Mark Maron, said when talking about racism that racism was, quote, part of our DNA, end quote. That's a pretty big claim. And by 2020, apparently a lot of people believe that. Most of your social media friends probably believe that because a lot of the posts, I try to stay away from social media on July 4th because it was all like backhanded compliments of America, like land of the free for some. Oh, don't you enjoy freedom? If we were free. And it's just like all these quotes that just like try to completely smear American history. But let's get right into the American history. So part of our DNA, that's what racism is, according to President Barack Obama. And he's not the only one saying this, right? This is made obvious by the protests that happened through the last couple of weeks and are still happening in some areas, right? This is way beyond the murder of George Floyd, because that went from just not being only a black man that was killed unjustly by a police officer, but instead it was a sign of a systemic problem in America, the systemic racial injustice in America. We heard all these big terms as systemic racism or institutional racism, right? All these protests were spearheaded by the organization Black Lives Matter, which focused from individual racism to this bigger idea of racism, and that is part of our DNA. And they don't just say part of our DNA, like it says that racism is still alive and well, that in fact our nation was founded in racism and slavery. I'm not making this up. Today we're going to talk a lot about the 1619 Project, which we delved a teeny weeny bit in the last episode, but today we're going to talk a lot about it because it deals with the founding of our country. And so now the narrative has changed, right? The narrative has changed from, it's not that racism exists in people, it exists in systems, it exists as a fundamental element. It's not even a fundamental element, it's the foundation of our country. I'm going to prove that to you. That is what people are saying. So what's happening now is that people are tearing down statues of American history because the narrative is no longer that they are racist people. So now it is racist systems. So it's no longer about reforming our systems to be better, but instead it's about destroying our systems and erasing history. This is why they're not just taking down Confederate statues, right? Because I get that argument. If there's Confederate statues and they fought for slavery, maybe we shouldn't make a statue of, okay, whatever. I get that argument. But now we're taking down statues of people like General Ulysses S. Grant, right? Because he was part of the oppressive system, even though he was a Union general who defeated the Confederacy and helped free the slaves. Or like George Washington. Oh, what an oppressive figure of the patriarchy of America. We must take him down. Or now you have even people trying to take down a monument of Abraham Lincoln telling a slave to rise because he has been set free. Because it is oppressive In 2020, we woke and we know the real history of that statue, even though that statue was paid by freed slaves to remember the freedom that was paid for by the Civil War. So again, we in 2020, this is woke culture. I was listening to a historian talk about a little bit the 1619 Project, and it was really cool just to see that he mentioned his 8-year-old son told him, "Dad, you know there's 2 pandemics going on right now." They said, "You know what? What is it, son?" Well, he's like, "Well, obviously COVID-19, and you can catch that. It's pretty. It spreads pretty quick." And the dad's like, "Okay, what's the second pandemic?" "Oh, it's Woke-19. And you can catch that on the internet." Yeah, that's kind of true. Woke-19, because guess what? Now statues have been removed from over 30 cities. So with this in mind, it's no surprise that July 4th was criticized, right? Just last week, the musician Pharrell Williams, which I guess apparently not very happy, pun intended, about July 4th. He was on CNBC criticizing the holiday and calling for reparations. So what are we even celebrating on July 4th? Are we even allowed, or are we just celebrating an oppressive moment in history? Like, what is the true founding of our country? What defines us? The year 1619 or 1776? All right, let's catch you up to speed. So let's ask this question. What makes America unique? Right? That's a fair question to ask, especially when you're celebrating July 4th. So let's put it this way. Let's answer that question by trying to explain what America is to a fellow alien from space. If a fellow alien from space came over and said, tell me what makes America special. Tell me what makes America unique. Well, what people say and what culture says is that we should start with slavery, because that's what apparently makes America unique. And in fact, that slavery should not just be part of the narrative, but it should be the main narrative of American history. This is the actual goal of the infamous/famous 1619 Project from the New York Times. And I quote, "The 1619 Project is an ongoing initiative from the New York Times Magazine that began in August 2019 in the 400th anniversary of the beginning of American slavery." Here it comes. "It aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of a national narrative." Yeah, the very center. The lead writer, Nicole Hannah-Jones, actually goes even further, saying that, quote, "The year 1619 is as important to the American story as 1776. The Black Americans, as much as those cast in alabaster in the nation's capital, are this nation's true founding fathers, and that no people has a greater claim to the flag than us." Nicole Hannah-Jones is Black, so that's what she's saying, that Black people have the greatest claim on the American flag. Well, 1619 was a date when Americans, who were not Americans at that point, were English, bought 20 to 30 slaves from English pirates. And if those slaves were also the true founding of the fathers, the true founding fathers of our country, then that implies that that moment is a true founding, that slavery is a true founding of this country. So is that what we are remembering and celebrating on July 4th, a country founded on slavery? Well, Nicole Hannah-Jones is not done yet. She continues saying, "At the time, that's 1776, 1/5 of the population within the 13 colonies struggled under a brutal system of slavery, unlike anything that had existed in the world before." Again, I'm quoting the New York Times right now. Chattel slavery was not conditional, but racial. Jefferson's fellow white colonists knew that Black people were human beings, but they created a network of laws and customs, outstanding for both their precision and cruelty, that ensured that enslaved people would never be treated as such. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Slavery is completely evil, and we're going to be talking about the history of slavery in just a second. But we have to understand the claims that are being made here, that slavery is what defines us, that slavery is what's unique about America, that it's unlike anything that had existed in the world before, that these white people like Jefferson created laws to ensure that enslaved people would never be treated as such. So, how do we explain the U.S. to our fellow alien from space? Well, we could say that the U.S. is a unique evil founded on the false ideals on the backs of slaves that were subjected to a never-seen-before system of slavery that permeates our system even to this day. But is that a true and accurate representation of American history? Time for the history lesson. I wish I had like a little song. That sounds like John Cena music. Okay, history lesson. This is super important. So slavery is an absolute evil. It's so evil that we have to understand its history, because apparently people think that slavery is uniquely like an American problem. So if you were going to talk about America, you must talk about slavery. No, we didn't create slavery, even as one Senator Kane said a couple weeks ago on the Senate. So this information that I'm going to share with you is non-controversial facts, but apparently not known by many. So if you're interested about my sources, you're more than welcome to email me. The email is going to be on screen, or you can see in the details of my podcast if you want the specific sources where I got all this information from. So let's go back and take a timeline back to 9,000 years ago when slavery was first recorded in Mesopotamia. What the heck? Where the heck is Mesopotamia? Well, Mesopotamia is not here. It's generally like right about the Middle East and in that section where slavery was first documented, where prisoners of war were made into slaves. Then in 1700 BC, that's before Christ, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites, as we can see from Exodus 21. The reason I'm bringing this up is because the 1619 project says that the American slavery had never been seen before, because it was, quote, heritable, impermanent, not temporary, meaning generations of black people were born into it and passed their enslaved status onto their children, end quote. This is horrible, and it's something that happened in the U.S., but that's the exact type of slavery that the Israelites experienced. This is not to downplay American slavery, but we need to know our history. So the fact that trying to claim that America is unique in its practice of slavery is completely afactual and ahistorical. Hey, we're not done yet. So then let's move on to the Greeks. The Greeks also practiced it in cities like Athens and Sparta that really relied heavily on slave labor. In fact, the Romans were pretty notorious, I should say, for their practice of slavery. From his ancient history encyclopedia, historian Mark Cartwright says this, quote, slavery was an ever-present feature of the Roman world. As many as 1 in 3 of the population in Italy, or 1 in 5 across the empire, were slaves. 1 in 3 in Italy and 1 in 5 across the entire empire. That's pretty big. But okay, you might object. Well, you see, what made America unique, a unique evil, is that it was based on race, and that they must have been the first ones who enslaved black people. Sadly and tragically, that's wrong. Because starting from the 8th century, that's 700 AD, African slaves were being sold in the Muslim world. That's more than 1,000 years before this country was founded, and black slaves were already being sold in the Muslim world. That's how tragic this whole institution of racism. And no, it did not start with the U.S., but we're not even done yet. By 1000 AD, slavery was pretty common in England. And that was whenever the poor were yoking themselves to their landlords as a type of debt bondage. Then came the infamous transatlantic slave trade, beginning in 1444 when some Portuguese traders brought their first large group of Africans to the European continent. So that's 1444, right? So far, there's been a lot of history so far since 9,000 years ago. But let's move on to the year 1526, because in 1526, that's 200 years before the United States is even founded, and slavery is a worldwide phenomenon. It could even be said that slavery has been virtually practiced by virtually every nation on earth. I say virtually, I'm sure there's 1 or 2, but if you just study the history of slavery, you see that almost every type, even tribes, practiced it, as we will later discuss. So then came the year 1619. The infamous year, 1619. That's when, according to the New York Times article, was when English colonists at Jamestown bought about 20 to 30 enslaved Africans from English pirates, thus the true founding of America. You see, it's interesting because it even says that in 1619, that was a year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. But we're totally going to ignore that because that has nothing to do with the founding of our country. All that faith and the faith of the Pilgrims, nothing to do with our country. But this is the cement of the foundation in 1619. Nothing to do with 1620 in the Pilgrims and their faith. No, we're not going to focus on that. We're just going to solely focus on slavery. So then the history lesson continues. In 1776 was the Revolutionary War, what we call as the war for independence of America, which is interesting because the 1619 Project, previously to March, had actually had the audacity of saying that the main motivation, check this out, the main motivation of wanting freedom from England was to keep our slaves. I'm sorry, what? If you heard the mic peak, that's because that's how startled I was when I read that. But it received some pushbacks from notable historians like Victoria Bynum, George Henry Davis. These are emeritus professors of American history at Princeton University. James Oakes, distinguished professor, the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Then you have someone like Gordon S. Wood and Alva Wade, University emeritus professor of history at Brown University. All these scholars and historians who knew history said, okay, wait a minute, you're making a pretty big claim without providing any evidence. You see where this narrative is trying to be pushed, as if here's white America, all America was either it was the black slaves and then the white supremacists. That has been the story of this country, which is false. So hopefully, now that you've learned a little bit of the institution of slavery, has kind of put it into a little bit of perspective. Now you know the historical context. Because now it can be said that slavery was part of the historical landscape during our country's founding, but not the foundation of it. I'll say that again. Slavery was part of the historical landscape during our country's founding, but not the foundation. So now you know that the claim that slavery is the main narrative in America's history is not true. That slavery in America was a unique evil that had never been seen before. Not true. Still evil, but it's just, you have to know your history. Now, the idea that these white men founded a country based on false ideals and wanted to preserve slavery, well, let's talk about that next because, okay, Andrew, if our country wasn't founded on slavery, what was it founded on? Well, some of the most famous and powerful lines in all of human history. Thomas Jefferson says it. This is in the Declaration of Independence. We almost all know the first lines by heart. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed." That is what America is founded on. Not slavery, but those perfect ideals. You see, that's what makes America so unique, that it is founded on powerful and perfect ideals, not by perfect people, but on perfect ideals. So let's put it briefly. Here are three things that makes America unique. It's the belief in natural rights pre-existing government. You see that the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property, that belongs to you. No matter what the government says, they cannot infringe on them. They cannot give it to them. That's the difference of a communist government. Because Marxism, for example, believes that a human being has no rights unless given to them by the state. And that's wrong. We all have rights. Because if the government only gives you the rights, then they can fairly take it away. So that's the first thing that makes America unique, is a belief in natural and pre-existing rights. The second thing is that making government there to protect your rights and not infringe on those rights. And the last thing is that equality of all human beings before the law. It doesn't mean that we all have the same abilities and that we all should have the same result and the same outcome. No, it's the equal of opportunity and the equality of everyone before the law. Now, these ideals are true and were true when the country was founded. But it's also true that this took a very long time to become a reality for 1/5 of the population, the black slaves. You see, you can talk about history because history deals with the good, the bad, and the ugly. But for those who try to say that these ideals are false and that they were just another form of white supremacy, go completely against the abolitionists of the time. People like Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln or other abolitionists or Martin Luther King Jr., they all believed in the values and hold these truths to be self-evident. They didn't call them racist white supremacy bigotry. It was the inspiration. In fact, people who believed that these were false were actual slaveholders, or I believe his name is Calhoun. If you look him up, he was one of the slave advocates and he believed that no, not all men were created equal. So these were true. You see, the picture that they want to paint is that since 1776, white men formed systems to ensure that black slaves would never be treated equal to the white man. And then something kind of happened in the 1800s, something about a war. Anyways, let's fast forward, and then we get to right around the Civil Rights Movement, and then we're in 2020. Still dealing with the effects of racism, and it's still a sin that must be atoned for. Look, and then they say if it wasn't solely for the blacks fighting against the evil white majority, then we wouldn't be a democracy. Or as Nicole Hannah-Jones says, we would be a slaveocracy. But that's not what history shows us. You see, something to understand about history is that it's complicated. You deal with people in their historical and social context. You don't deal with them from as if you were in 2020. You deal with them in their social and historical context. You see, contrary to popular belief, not all Americans were on board about slavery. Yeah, not all Americans were on board about slavery. In 1775, the Quakers in Pennsylvania founded the first abolitionist society. An abolitionist is the person who favors the abolition or the dismantlement of the institution of slavery. So in 1775, the Quakers had already begun their first abolitionist society. Then John Adams, one of the founding fathers, was an abolitionist himself. Then you had some founders who were slaveholders as well. It was a mixed group, again, imperfect people. They were all trying to bring a nation together. You see, the founding fathers knew that they needed the support of the southern slaves that were benefiting the most from slavery. So they had to make some compromises that hurt a lot of people, like not making slavery illegal as part of the Constitution right away. And that's not because they were racist bigots, because if the South wouldn't have joined the North and practically maybe become their own country, there's no telling that they would have actually ever abolished slavery because there would have been no Civil War. So then you had things like the compromise of the Three-Fifths Clause, which made non-free people, that means slaves, count as 3/5 of a free individual. And people try to cite this as a racist part of the Constitution, when some have argued, like I've heard Ben Shapiro, that it was in terms of representation. It wasn't that a slave had the value of 3/5 of a free person, but it had the representation. Because if you give the Southerners who had more slaves more representation because of their slaves, then they could actually make policies, because the slaves can't vote for themselves at that point. It would be the white slave owners that would just have more representation in Congress and be able to pass more laws to benefit their evil intentions. So that's one of the important parts. So this whole idea that the founders created systems to keep slavery is not true. Here are some inconvenient facts. In 1780, Massachusetts became the first state to abolish slavery in its constitution, 4 years after the nation was founded, which John Adams was one of the founders that drafted the Constitution. In 1807, 3 weeks before the British abolished the Atlantic slave trade, President Jefferson signed a law prohibiting the importations of slaves into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States. Again, Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence. Why would that white racist bigot create systems to hold slaves only to about 30 years later abolish the importation of slaves into any area of the United States? So by 30 years into the nation's history, the importation of slaves had already been abolished. However, the pain of the American slave is very real, especially in the South. So please, understand that I'm not diminishing slavery. It was still very real. So much so that in 1852, Frederick Douglass, a freed black slave, delivered a powerful and convicting speech before the nation. It was titled, "What to the Slave is 4th of July?" And actually, it was quoted a lot during this weekend, which I'll talk about that. And he says this: he understands that the ideals of the country were founded, were true, and the founding fathers were worth respecting. Here's what he says. I'll read a part of it. He says, quote, "The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too. Great men to give free frame to a great age. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. So are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?" That's a powerful question. He recognized the goodness and the bravery of the founding fathers, that they founded perfect ideals, invaluable ideals, but then asked, are these being extended to the black man? And the answer back then was no. It was tragically no. You see, he said this in a time when slavery was still alive and well. And it is hard to read the whole thing because it is convicting. And he's just naming, calling people out. But then to understand and see people quote Frederick Douglass's speech that was said in 1853, and to quote it as if that has the same power in 2020? Are you kidding me? Like, if his speech has the same significance in 2020, like, you have to understand that this completely ignores and dishonors the lives that were lost answering Frederick's question that if these rights were extended to the black man. Because 9 years after his speech, after he gave the speech, the bloodiest war of America had ever seen happen. 650 to 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. This was a war fought to bring the end of slavery in America. Then in 1863, inspired by the truths of the Declaration of Independence, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing slaves. So to try to divide the country into black and white sections and seeing our history through the lens of race is absolutely wrong. Slavery slavery was real in America. In the price that we as Americans, not as a black person or as a white person, but as Americans, pay to end it was also real. So history shows us that it's been a struggle to live up to the values of the Declaration of Independence. But you see, there's a problem that in 2020, we don't truly value some of the most memorable moments in American history. So we have stopped, and then we don't value the moments that have stopped slavery, that have ended segregation, because racism apparently is still alive in the institutions today. It's not just about the human heart, but it's fundamental to America. So what is just surprising? It's surprising that people in 2020 seem to be acting like if they were the first people virtue signaling about slavery, even though they never experienced it, completely ignoring the sacrifice of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Americans who paid to bring that to an end and to live up to the perfect values that this country was founded on. So it's behind us. Slavery is behind us. Does that mean that racism doesn't exist in America? Of course not. Racism is a problem in the human heart. You see, it's not ingrained in the system. It's in the human heart because of sin, because of pride. The years, the 9,000 years of slave history shows us that it's not a white and black problem. It is a human sin problem. And there's a danger in misdiagnosing the problem. Just as if you were to insist that someone had cancer and you put them through chemo when they just had a headache. You see, slavery is not in our DNA. If it was, it couldn't be changed. But we have changed. So today, in 2020, not in 1856 as a white man in the South holding slaves, but as 2020, today, I am proud to be an American. We'll see you in the next episode of The Andrew Roman Show.